Caregiving Club on Air. This podcast is dedicated to the millions of family caregivers who want wellness tips and self-care solutions, who seek expert advice, and who want news about healthy aging and how to create well home design in our forever homes. I'm Sherry Snelling, a corporate gerontologist, author, and educator, a TV interviewer, host, and news commentator. I'm joining you from Southern California, where our interviews and news take us all across the country to explore the many ways to help you on your caregiving journey and to lift you up here at Caregiving Club on Air. Welcome to Caregiving Club on Air. I'm your host, Sherry Snelling. And for our second episode in March, we have three wonderful interviews with the ladies of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, which is our preeminent organization that supports the caregivers of our military veterans. And that is going to be fantastic. We have these wonderful interviews. I've been wanting to get the Elizabeth Dole Foundation on this podcast for a long time. So now we have three wonderful interviews from them. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Caregiver Fellows program, as well as the Hidden Heroes program that they have, which are great examples of really how we can support caregivers of anybody, but these are very specific programs, of course, for the caregivers of veterans, which are just great, best practices, I think, for all of us to look at. And then one of our interviews is with Roxana Delgado, and her veteran husband suffered a traumatic brain injury during his military service and came home and went through a lot of rehabilitation. And during that period, Roxana and her husband, obviously were navigating a very difficult, complicated, fragmented healthcare system, through the VA and other different services that they needed. So she's going to tell us that story. But March is also National Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month. And because of that, we have another great interview with Dr. Gail Anderson, who heads up a lot of the TBI rehabilitation at the Brooks Rehabilitation Hospital in Florida. And what Dr. Anderson is going to share with us is that, we think about TBIs being something that our military war fighters, our football players, hockey players, professional boxers may get, but TBIs can happen to anyone of any age. Dr. Anderson is going to share those insights, but also, more importantly, she's going to share how do we communicate and support our loved ones who may have a TBI. And I think this also relates to family caregivers who may have a loved one who has perhaps a stroke or another neurological, damage. And so that's going to be a really great interview as well. Because we have four fantastic interviews for this episode, we're going to forego our typical caregiver wellness news and well home design news. We're going to, save that for our April episode that comes up after this one, because we want to get to these interviews right away and share all of this great information with you. So now let's go ahead and go to the interviews with the three ladies, as I mentioned, from the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, which is our nation's preeminent organization empowering and supporting our nation's millions of military and veteran caregivers. And that's the military and military veterans across all wars. So it's not just the most recent Afghanistan, or Iran and other things that have gone on. It's actually, Korean War, which was my stepdad was a veteran of, certainly the Vietnam War, Desert Storms, and others. And they support all of those caregivers. So we're going to hear about those programs. And earlier this year, Senator Elizabeth Dole 21st Century Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act was signed into law to significantly expand support for home caregivers of aging and disabled veterans. So that's good news because, we certainly want to support our military families, and particularly our veterans who have suffered on our behalf to give us our freedom, and their families who are there to support them. So the following three interviews I talked to, these are all ladies who are, associated executives with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, but they are all also family caregivers of veterans. So we're going to first talk to Roxana Delgado, as I mentioned. She is a Dole Caregiver Fellow, and her husband, Victor, his vehicle was hit by an explosive formed projectile He sustained a traumatic brain injury along with other injuries. And then during his 2.5-year rehabilitation, Roxana and Victor identified gaps in the healthcare system surrounding his diagnosis and treatment. And with her research background in health sciences, they worked together to shape new military healthcare policies. So this is a really great story. You're going to love this interview with Roxana. And then coming up right after Roxana, we have Liz Rotenberry, who is the director of caregiver engagement for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. She's going to tell us more about this fellows program that Roxana is part of and other support programs for family caregivers of veterans. And then finally, Marianne Delatorre is heading up the Hidden Heroes program nationwide, which brings together local caregivers of veterans and also the local communities to support our military families, but particularly our caregivers of veterans. So, again, you're going to learn a whole lot about the great programs that are being done to support these caregivers of veterans that I think become an example of how we should support all family caregivers. So, with that, let's go ahead and launch into our interview with Roxana Delgado. So I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Roxana Delgado on our episode. She is also associated with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. She's actually a Dole Fellow, Caregiver Fellow, and she's going to tell us all about that journey. But she has a really interesting story with her and her husband and navigating the healthcare system and also advocating for caregivers and for their loved ones in the healthcare system. So, Roxana, welcome to Caregiving Club on Air.
Thank you so much for having me, Sherry. I'm very
Well,
excited to be here.
I know, and I'm excited to have our listeners hear your story. As I mentioned to you before we push record here, we always ask our guests, where are we talking to you from today?
So I live in the beautiful small town of Fair Oaks Ranch, Texas, that is northwest of San Antonio. And I'm joining out of, from my home office at home.
Oh,
of course,
lovely.
the home office. Of course, it's at home.
We love Texas. I'm in California. And a lot of my friends have moved to Texas, so it's a beautiful state and wonderful area. So, well, we're so glad you could join us today. And first of all, I wanted to start because you do have a PhD. And I know that you've worked in healthcare. So, first of all, let's start a little bit with your story. And then I'm going to have you also launch into telling us a little bit more about you and your husband, Victor. But let's start first with your background and your story.
Sure. So I'm a professor at UT Health San Antonio in the School of Nursing, and I focus most of my work is research looking at the health and well-being of military caregivers and caregivers as a whole, and looking at those trajectories of health, seeing how caregiving is affecting their life, but also doing some of the implementation science, which includes creating programs and ensuring that programs are adequate for to serve our caregiver community. So that's basically in a nutshell what I do. And again, I'm here in the San Antonio area, and it's not by chance that this happened. All my work life, my career, everything has been informed and it has been inspired by my own personal story. So I'm glad that you asked, and we can dive in if you want more. I'm an open book, so feel free to ask anything.
Well, I think it's fascinating because you do have this career, and obviously you're a doctor and you have a profession in research and nursing, and so you understand the healthcare system. But you've also experienced this from a personal perspective. So tell us a little bit about the story of you and your husband Victor. Kind of how you met, and then certainly Victor's service and what happened because we know he experienced a traumatic brain injury, and then where that took you from there. So tell us a little bit about your love story.
Sure. So I met Victor when I was in college. We were very young, and we met in college. But to my surprise and to his surprise, we actually went to the same school. So we kind of like knew who each other was. We connected through a common friend. And for Victor, he said that was it. He said, "I'm marrying her. That's the girl."
Love at first sight. I love those guys.
And he told my best friend, one of my friends, she's the one. I'm gonna marry her. And basically my friend said, well, good luck. Because we're undergrad students. My friend knew that my career was everything to me, and I had really vision, right, to becoming someone that would continue graduate school and all that. So anyway, Victor was very sweet, very kind, persistent, and he won my heart. So we dated for 4 years, and then we married in 2000, and we're going on 25 years now.
Oh,
And
congratulations.
he actually met the promise that he made. He said that he told his friend, if I marry her, I'm going to make her the happiest girl on earth. And it's been a wonderful marriage. It's been a wonderful relationship. But of course, we have faced our own challenges, especially after he was wounded in Iraq. So.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about his service, what branch of the military he was in, and then how long he was serving before he was then injured, and then what happened after that when he returned and obviously had to go through a lot of rehabilitation and other treatments and things for TBI. So tell me about that part of
It
it.
is very interesting because Victor was he always loved the military. So he was always very forthcoming about his love for the military. While we were dating, he was an Army Reserve because he was in college, and then when he graduated, the 9/11 happened, and we all know, how tragic and how much that moved a lot of our military in our world, in our, at least in our nation. And Victor chose to be active duty. He by then we were married, and Victor said, I want to dedicate my life to being a career soldier. And I joined. I said, absolutely, let's do it. We know that when military sign up, the family signs up with them. So we started like any other family, right? Being in the military, in the active duty side, we were stationed in different places, and Victor went into the normal routine, deployments. So he deployed to Afghanistan in 2004, and he deployed to Iraq. The second time of his deployment was Iraq in 2006. And then the third deployment was 2009. And that is the one that really changed our lives, because he was in patrol when his vehicle was hit by an explosive form projectile. And he lost consciousness. He sustained a moderate traumatic brain injury with 3 bleedings in his brain. And from there, he was medically evacuated. So when Victor came home after the evacuation, he went through the normal, medical evacuation, going to Landstuhl Army Medical Center. He came home for extensive rehab. And that's what, really opened my eyes, that the man that came back, the soldier that came back, is not the same person that went to deployment. So we face a lot of different challenges from, his recovery. He went through 3 years of full-time rehab. I always say I drop him off in the morning and then pick him up in the afternoon, and he was in all day with a treatment plan. So it's very challenging, of course, and these are the many challenges that family members have endured, where we become the care coordinator. But then, of course, we also see the loved one that so much we had a life with them, and goals and dreams being cut short. So we were one of those, military families that we thought we were going to continue service for 30 years, and that was not the case. So.
And I know that a lot of our listeners may not be caregivers of someone who is active military or a veteran, but certainly traumatic brain injury can happen to anybody. And so, tell us a little bit about that journey in becoming Victor's caregiver and care partner, and helping him through that rehabilitation of 3 years and all of that. But what traumatic brain injury really meant to you, and how that unfolded.
I'm glad you're asking that question, because what people don't realize is that in the nation we have 2.8 million traumatic brain injuries every year. It's the number one cause of disabilities in the United States. And
Wow.
there's groups that are very vulnerable. We have the children, the elderly, or the older adults. These are groups that are very vulnerable. But we also have, someone like you and me, Sherry. Like we can get into a car accident at any time. So we have people sustaining traumatic brain injuries every day in our nation. What makes it so unique in the veteran community is that many times this injury occurred during the combat because of the explosions and the environment that they were exposed to. But today, when we look at as a whole in the nation, many people have a traumatic brain injury, and sometimes they're walking around and they don't even know it. They know that there's something different. They know they were into a car accident, and they have short-term memories, and they have some physical injuries, and perhaps they ended up in a coma and they just came back from a coma, and now they're different, right?
Right.
But they don't sometimes put that name into it. And many times the healthcare community does not diagnose well the traumatic brain injury. So the challenges are varied, because when you have someone with a TBI, traumatic brain injury, so we call it TBI, we have someone that has been affected physically, emotionally, socially. You tend to see these families that have a higher need because there's a lot of recovery in the middle of everything, or there's a treatment plan that is very aggressive or very intense. They lose their friends. They stop being part of the community as they knew it. They have financial strains, emotional strains, physical strains. Many times the family members, then they have to help with the activities of daily living, like bathing and being there for the person to help them in every aspect, right, of their daily needs and the basic needs as a human. So when we see that, sometimes it's families, they tend to stay within their households and not share too much. Even the neighbors sometimes don't know that. They know there's something wrong and something happened, but many times not even the neighbors are aware of the challenges that these families are going through. And that is why it's so important to advocate, right, for the caregivers and for these
Mm.
family caregivers who are undertaking this role like every day. I always say that the caregivers are the backbone, right, and the first line of response to long-term care for our loved ones. So
Yeah, it's so interesting because I've been in this space now for about 20 years, and I've talked about caregivers as being the largest volunteer long-term care army that
yes,
we have in the
yes.
nation, because you're serving as well. You impact a lot of things in what you just said, but I want to focus on a couple of the points. One was you talk about it was maybe difficult to get the right diagnosis, and you did. We all know that the healthcare system is very fragmented, very complicated. Sometimes you get, like you said, a good diagnosis, sometimes not. What was that journey like for you, and what were the gaps that you really saw? Even though you've been in healthcare and working in healthcare, what were those gaps that you saw that need to really be addressed? And then I know you went out and advocated for that, and even got some policy and some legislation around it. Tell us a little bit about that.
So one of the biggest hurdles or gaps that existed with brain injuries was the identification. We were not identifying well brain injuries in the military, but also in the civilian. Right, when you go to any ER after a car accident, more likely they're going to focus on the physical injuries, but very unlikely that personnel would emphasize or put a lot of attention into the brain injury. And if you're lucky, you're going to leave that emergency department with a diagnosis of a concussion or a traumatic brain injury. So one of the biggest things for me was like identifying the brain injury. If you don't identify how you're going to treat it, we know that brain injuries, the more that you wait for the treatment, the more detrimental it's going to be for the patient and the person. And that is going to have immediate impact in the family members, because now they have to fulfill that role of being the caretaker and not necessarily really knowing where to go and how to do things, right? So for the
Yeah.
family members, for the patients, for everyone to be able to know where to seek help and what resources they need, they have to identify it. So one of the first things that my husband and I did to change the policies was identifying the brain injuries, but also providing the care. And in the Department of Defense back then, they established programs across the nation to make sure that service members with brain injury were cared for, but at the same time, they focus on the family members to ensure that they understood what was ahead. So those were some of the initial, if you want to call it like policy changes that happened more at the level of the Department of Defense, and what we wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and I think, you make a great point, and I think I see it because I do a lot of work in more brain health and brain injuries and brain diseases, and even with something like Alzheimer's or dementia, a lot of our primary care physicians and just general doctors just don't know enough to even, really identify the symptoms, get you to the right specialist or whatever. So it's a whole new area I think that we also have to be advocating for. You touched on something else and you said when you don't talk about it or you don't know that maybe you have that, your loved one has that diagnosis, then you can't get the right help and support. Tell me a little bit about how did you get support as a family caregiver, as somebody who was experiencing TBI and going through that? What were your support systems?
It was very challenging to find because in some way navigating the system was one of the most critical challenges at that time because there was not really a whole lot for family caregivers, especially those who were younger. Remember that this is like 16 years ago when all this happened. So I was in my early 30s. I was in the middle of doing my PhD, working full time, and that's what we see in our families when we look back 20 years ago, 16 years ago, right? Like myself. So there was not a lot of services. Most of the services for caregiving were focused on the older population, like 65 plus. So first of all, it makes us feel like we were outcasts, right? There was nothing for us. So I had to reinvent myself in some way. And when there was no resources, I had to really continue to knock on doors and even create some resources like support groups and places where it created community among very similar caregivers like myself. So I had a great support system. Don't get me wrong. I had an incredible support system. My parents were close by. We had a great help from friends and family, but also at the same time, by changing some of the policies in the DoD, my husband was one of the first soldiers or first service members to receive some of the care that the Department of Defense started, providing to the service members. So that's why he was able to go for 3 years to a full-time rehab center, a private rehab center paid by the DoD. But at the same time, is feeling the isolation as a family member, as a caregiver. And those, I say that sometimes that was the most difficult for me, to feel like I didn't fit in anywhere.
Mm.
But at the same time, you keep pushing through. What are you going to do? I cannot change the circumstances, but I could manage how I was going to react to it. And that's basically what I did 16 years ago. I tried to find my way and really navigate the system with whatever was available to me.
Well, it sounds like you've got great resiliency and grit, which we know is kind of part of the DNA, I think, of the military families and
Yes.
community. Do you did you find that friends and maybe coworkers, I mean, did they really understand what you were going through or what your husband was kind of suffering from? Were you able to also help educate them around things like TBI? I mean, what was that kind of like for you?
I had the best, support system. I used to work with most of my colleagues were all either retired military, they were affiliated to the military. We were really nice, close knit in that sense, and great colleagues. So they understood. Some of them, they helped. They step up to say, "Hey, is there anything that I can do, or is there anything that?" There was one that he was a psychologist, and I remember him saying, "Hey, if you ever need anything, I won't put it on the books. Just talk to me. You can call me anytime," because he knew that with caregiving comes a lot of emotional strains, right, and everything. And at
Yeah.
that time, I did not recognize any of that. It's not until you feel the burnout, it's not until you feel like there's sorrow and isolation, that then you tend to say, "Oh, I remember what so and so said." So I had a great support system in that sense. When it comes to we didn't. We as caregivers, and I think this is the commonality, we tend to isolate ourselves and we don't want to
Mm.
share too much. So when it comes to neighbors and people who were close to us, they may not know, they didn't know as much, not because they didn't want to be there, but because we potentially didn't share a lot. And
Yeah.
and let's face it, in that at that time I was going to school full time. I was working full time, plus I was caring for Victor. I had no time to slow down. So I was always on the go, always trying to get to the next day, to the next phase, to the next step, right? So I was kind of like cruising and going fast and really trying to overcome as I was going in my journey, but at the same time, not being too cognizant and wanting to share too much of my life back then. But anyway, so that's basically that. There's some challenges, of course, that we see in the caregivers. And back then, one thing that I can tell you is that I shared challenges with other caregivers. And we would all like start, talking about it. And that's when I noticed that caregivers needed a bit more support. I feel very blessed because I had a lot of resources around me, being in the military, having, healthcare insurance and everything that we need. But it is when I was speaking with other caregivers in the community that I noticed that there were some critical needs out there. So anyway, so that's basically.
I think that's an important point because I think you're right. I think very often, sometimes depending on the diagnosis, I know I see a lot of it with Alzheimer's that the person with the disease doesn't want anyone to know. So then the burden's on the caregiver to not maybe share that and or just being private. You don't want to share a lot, but the ability to talk to others who are going through the same thing, I think, is so crucial, right? Because you finally can relax, you can share the frustrations and all the downsides. Sometimes we just don't want to be a burden, we don't want to be negative, but we can feel free sometimes when other people have been through it as well.
And you get to learn new, about new resources or things that you can use. And it's powerful. Creating community is one of the most powerful tools that we can use.
Yeah. Well, and that's going to take us to the Dole Caregiver Fellows and that program. But before we move on, I just want to ask you, how is Victor doing now?
He's doing fantastic. So 16 years later, today he runs his own nonprofit. He's fully independent. If you see him out and about, you would not tell. He still has disabilities, but he has learned very well how to overcome the disabilities and how to adapt and live with them. So he's doing fantastic. Thank you for asking.
Of course. No, and of course, and a lot of it to your wonderful nurturing and caregiving of him. So let's talk about the Caregiver Fellows program because this is a way for you to use your voice and advocate and be part of that support program for other caregivers. So tell us a little bit about your role and what you're doing.
So the Dole Foundation Fellowship Program started in 2012. I became a fellow in 2015, and it has been one of the best. Applying to that program was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. I was at a point where I was still a caregiver back then. In 2015, I still was doing some caregiving, for my husband. But at the same time, I was already like working on policies and programming and everything that you can think of to improve the health and well-being of caregivers. And a friend of mine told me, "Hey, you should submit your application to the Dole Foundation because it will give you a voice. It will amplify what you're doing." And long and behold, I submitted and I was selected. So I represent the state of Texas, and that has allowed me to be a voice for the caregivers in the state. I have been able to meet with legislators and really look at what are those unmet needs of the caregiver community in our own region, in our own communities, and being able to make changes. The beauty of the fellowship is that you go through a training. They teach you should you speak with legislators. What is the whole basically what is the protocols and the process to be able to change legislations, to create policies or shift policies, all these different things. But what I love is that it's a very collective effort. They take the time to really understand the caregiving community as a whole and nationwide. That is why in 2014 they commissioned the RAND Corporation to do the first population project or study. And from that, they get to learn what are those unmet needs. And from there, the beauty is that then they activate their their fellows. And they said, okay, so in Texas, we identify, or in the nation, we identify these unmet needs. How can we make it better? They use us as conduit to creating community and changing and inspire policies or change the way that we practice right in our own community. So it is a beautiful collective effort that happens at the fellowship level. And like I said, the combination of having the education and the training, plus all the tools to be able to inspire and make those changes, that is a powerful tool. So, and it's really a great opportunity to create community. Right now, 10 years later, I can tell you that I feel like all the fellows even from the same class or different classes, we become like a huge family, and we call each other and we support each other. Just during my fellowship, I had three of my peers finish a PhD, and I sat in their dissertation, committees, because I already had a PhD. So we support each other, and we want to make sure that caregivers are not only well supported, but that they can thrive within their own communities.
Well, I think that's so important, and it's so great because, as you said, caregiving is not like a one size fits all. Not all solutions will work for different cities or communities or counties or states or whatever. So you can really kind of customize it or personalize it, but you can also share best practices with
Mm-hmm.
some of your colleagues of yours. I forgot to ask you, Roxana, and one of the things I've always focused on, particularly in the world of family caregiving, is self care, getting those respite breaks when you can. When you were going through the more intense caregiving with Victor, how did you find, or did you find me time? How did you get time for you to just kind of refresh and reset?
So it is. It is a very good question, and this is one of the things that I did. I started doing every 30 days or 60 days. I did the burnout scale. So that's my self-awareness. I was looking at, okay, Roxana, what can you do differently so you don't get burnout? There were so many different things happening. I was always on the go, always running. One of the things that I did the most was walking in nature. That's something that I still practice very much. I love being connected to nature. I feel like it was my me time, my respite care, the moment where I could just disconnect from everything else and just focus on that. I'm very big on faith. My life is faith-based. So for me, that was the spiritual part was so important. Like, practicing prayer every morning. I will wake up, and I still do earlier than, it's just my husband and I, but many times I wake up earlier than him. And then I have my kind of like my spot, right, where I get to read inspirational, things or the Bible, and just pray. And so, and that's what works for me, right? Like, it may not work for everyone, but that's my sense of self-care comes from not only that physical aspect or the emotional aspect, but that also spiritual aspect. And then being able to connect with others, and by serving, these days I dedicate my life to serving, and there's so much reward that comes out of it. So for me, self-care these days looks more like serving the community.
Well, you are my hero. You're my poster gal because I write about self-care and you hit some of the top ones, the being in nature part, the little sanctuary space you have, and also the spiritual side is so critical, I think, so important for so many of us to not feel alone, to have that higher power, that belief system. What if you could change anything to make it better for caregivers, about the healthcare system or any of your experiences, what would you change if you had a magic wand?
If I had a magic wand, I would like caregivers to not lose themselves to the role. I always say caregiver is a role, and it should not be your identity. So if I had a magic wand, I would like you know, first to have caregivers identify themselves that they are caregivers, that they have that they're starting a new journey, right? Because that will prepare them and set them for success in identifying where the pitfalls in their life that they need to, or not pitfalls, but challenges, right, in their life that they need to take care of, so they can get the resources they need. But then not losing themselves to caregiving, so they can continue to have a very fruitful, meaningful life, having their goals and dreams, that they can continue to move forward in this journey.
Well, and
And as
you,
a
again,
healthcare
you're a great
yeah.
example of that because you were faced with this huge challenge with your husband, but you were going through still getting your PhD, still following your dream. I think that's so important.
It is
Um,
important, and it
yeah,
also helps with the person not feeling that loss of self, right? That
yeah.
really keeping that identity of who they are. And the healthcare system, I wish the healthcare system would be more equipped to include the caregivers in everything that happens with their loved ones. I feel that the caregivers should be a very important part of the care of the person that, of course, they love. And I wish the healthcare system was a bit more tailored to not only assess the caregivers, right, to make sure that they're equipped to be able to care for that loved one and provide the services or the resources that they need to do so, but but also be more, as a caregiver, we know caregivers are advocates in nature, right? By nature. So if the healthcare system will be more equipped to be able to engage those caregivers in the system, will be a way better system than alienating them or leaving them in a waiting room.
Right. Absolutely. You're so right. They've got to be part of that crucial care team because
Mm-hmm.
they're kind of the hub, right? You're as a caregiver, you're the coordination point for all the different things that
Yes.
your loved one might need. So you've got to be part of that conversation and part of that team. My last question that I had was, a lot of people want to express gratitude for the service of your husband, your service. Do you feel that you get a lot of that from just the general people you bump into? And what should people say when they know that you are a veteran or a caregiver or spouse of a veteran? What is the right thing to thank you?
I think that, and after 15 years, of course, even with my husband's military service, you get a lot of like, thank you for your service. But I always say that sometimes it's better to do it in action, right? So actionable thank you for your service will be ensuring that if you have a neighbor or someone that is a caregiver, identifying what potential things they may need that they will never ask help for, right? Or maybe identifying services or programs in their own communities that are supporting caregivers and maybe volunteering there, or looking for ways to be part of the caregiver community as a way of support. So there's many different ways, and one of them is just being there, right? Is being a non-judgmental, listening, and just making feel that caregiver that they have been seen and that they're supported. And of course, there's organizations like the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. They're nationwide. And every day, and I have seen it for all the years that I've been with them, they have been identifying the needs and implementing programs that can affect the caregivers in a positive way across the nation. And there's certain programs that are unique to certain communities, and they make sure that those communities are well taken care of. So I think that by creating community, we can also, of course, make the caregivers that they are part of, the bigger community. So there's different ways, but I would say the most would be being that person that is there to support them wherever they're at, and with no judgment, understanding that the caregiving journey is a very challenging one, but at the same time can be a very rewarding one. And mine has been an example of how you take something from tragedy to triumph, and now I'm paying it forward. And that's what we want caregivers to do, to be able to be equipped and to have the resources and have everything they need so they can be successful and pay it forward.
Well, that is so beautifully said, and you are such an inspiration. I'm listening to you, and my heart is filling, and I'm saying this is such a great program and you're such a great advocate, and we need
Yeah.
caregivers to be uplifted, right? Whether they're caring for someone who's a veteran or military, active duty, or just general caregiving. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your story. What a wonderful love story of you and Victor and how you came through everything, and also sharing for us ways that we can help other caregivers and the wonderful, wonderful work being done at the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. So, Roxana, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I had such a fun, sharing my story and everything. And thank you so much for what you do. I always say that people can choose to support caregivers, and people can choose to make this world a better one for them. And you're one of those. Look, you have a whole program where you're really inspiring change. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you. Talking to people like you makes my day. So I enjoy it. So, well, you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day and life. And we just thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Sherry. You have a wonderful day. You as well.
Well, this episode is chock full of Elizabeth Dole Foundation folks, and I am so thrilled because I've wanted to be talking to them for such a long time. And so in this interview, we have Liz Rotenberry, who is the Director of Caregiver Engagement for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation and oversees this Dole Fellowship program that she's going to tell us more about. So, Liz, welcome to Caregiving Club on Air.
Hi, Sherry. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, as I said, it's just a thrill to have you on. I've really been a fan of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation for such a long time and all the great work that you do, and specifically for the caregivers of our military veterans. But Liz, one of the first questions we always ask all of our guests who come onto this podcast is, where are we talking to you from today?
Hi, I'm from Baltimore, Maryland.
Well, we love Baltimore, and we've had other guests on, so welcome. It's just great to have you. So, as I said, Liz, you oversee a lot of the different caregiver programs and caregiver engagement that the Elizabeth Dole Foundation does. But tell us specifically about the Dole Fellowship Program.
So our foundation started the Fellows Program back in 2012, originally when Senator Elizabeth Dole found herself at Walter Reed back in 2011, and really recognized that we had an epidemic of caregivers on the rise. We have loved ones sitting by the bedsides of wounded warriors who were having to leave their jobs, come out of retirement, quit school in order to take care of the number of wounded warriors that were surviving on the battlefields. So the foundation sat down with those caregivers and said, what can we do? How can we expand the supports that we're providing? And they decided to build this fellowship program. So 2012 is our first class of fellows. They're the emeritus fellows. Many of them sat with Senator Elizabeth Dole at Walter Reed and really shared their perspectives. And from there, it's grown to now the 2025 year of our fellowship class is going to be our 13th class. Over the years, this fellowship has evolved to now incorporate close to 300 caregivers, military and veteran caregivers, who represent every state, even our territories, Puerto Rico, and even the Virgin Islands. And there are boots on the ground. They have the eyes and the ears into what is happening in our community, what is needed. Maybe there's celebrations, maybe there's positive aspects to what's happening that they are not only personally experiencing, but maybe in the society around them. And so we want to uplift those voices and help continue a lot of this change and support and resources for our caregivers.
And it's so important. I think a lot of organizations have really wonderful missions, but they don't always connect with the actual people that they are maybe there to help. And as you said, listen to their voices. And so you're really out there hearing the stories, hearing the needs. What exactly, what is the criteria, for instance, to join or become one of the Dole Fellows?
We do have an application process for military and veteran caregivers to apply. And we like to say military and veteran because we want all aspects of our military, active duty, reserve, guard to know that they can apply. Our veterans know that they can apply. This is for all eras, which I love because so many programs and resources out there focus on our post 9/11. But Senator Elizabeth Dole recognized we have so many needs of our pre 9/11 that need support, that have voices, that have stories that can make a change and an impact. So it is all eras, it's all relationships. She also recognized that we're more than just military spouses and dependents. We are parents, we're siblings, we're friends, we're aunts and uncles, or, really any relationship to that wounded warrior or somebody who identifies as their loved one can apply. All injuries, wounds, and illnesses. We want to make sure that we're focused on those stories and those wounded warriors who haven't had a chance to be heard, who aren't getting those supports. And so what can we do to encourage that and uplift them to get them those resources? They can apply. Our application process is open every year towards the end of the year. And it does typically close at the beginning of the new year. So usually it opens around October and it'll close in January or February timeframe. But we are, going through applications right now. We're looking forward to bringing on a new class of fellows. We do select 10 to 15 to represent. I know it sounds like a small number, but we're growing in a mighty way, and we want to make sure that we keep the caregiver's voice at the forefront. And having a smaller class allows us to keep them involved, engaged, and really provide them the tools that they need.
So, specifically, what are some of the activities then that the fellows are doing? I know you said it's to share the voices of all of the caregivers of our military and our veterans, but can you give us a snapshot of maybe some of the activities and things that the fellows are doing?
Yeah, I've been so impressed with our fellows. I can tell you, I was a fellow myself. I came in 2015, and I'm now considered an alumni fellow. And over the years, what they have contributed has helped grow our foundation and our mission. As I said, when I first started, we were a small foundation. I think we had maybe 5 team members, working at the foundation. And our main objective was really going to the Hill, sharing our story, and trying to come up with ways to be involved. But now, because our caregivers and our fellows have shared so much with us, we've developed so many programs that have come out of this that we want our caregivers to be involved with. Some, work with us directly on our Hidden Helpers program, our Campaign for Inclusive Care, our mental wellness programs. We've got a lot to offer within the foundation, but on a local level, we want them to engage with their community. We want them to be involved and help spread the word to help caregivers not only identify, but get access to those supports and resources. We've had many fellows, especially we've had Linda Mays in El Paso is doing an amazing job. She's getting ready to host her 4th annual Borderplex event, which is bringing together MSOs, VSOs, caregivers, you name it. She's bringing them all together for a summit to really hear from the community and work together to identify those needs in El Paso. We've had another caregiver, Alicia Mataloni in Alaska. Alaska is so far removed, from much of what we do here in the States that we want to support those caregivers in those areas. So she's working with not only the bases to help the military and the active duty members come together as caregivers and identify as caregivers to provide retreats. She's working with the veterans there to offer them this space to come together as peers, bringing together resources. American Red Cross is up there, Wounded Warrior Project. She gets them all involved. And so not only is she providing them a retreat opportunity, but she's giving them the tools and the education during that time frame to know more about self-care, what's accessible for their families, how can they improve their own mental health or well-being. And so we have caregivers doing a lot of work, attending resource fairs, going to speaking engagements, media opportunities. I'm sorry, I could go on forever because I'm just so proud of how much they are doing and changing in our community.
Well, and it's such a wonderful collective community, but as you said, also speaking very much to that local, so often we talk about caregiving as this monolith, and we know it's not a one size fits all. Every caregiver has a very personalized, specific experience. One of the things I was curious about is having been in this field of caregiving now for a long time, we know that caregivers, even still today, don't necessarily self-identify as a caregiver. What have you found within the military community? Are a lot of the caregivers more prone to say, yes, I'm a caregiver for a loved one, or are they still not necessarily raising their hand and say I'm a caregiver? And how do you overcome, that hurdle?
Well, that's a great question. I think, I've seen a mix of ways that we can help caregivers identify. When you look at the military community, taking it personally and looking at myself and my family, when my husband, being a Marine, was first injured, maybe not necessarily wanting to call me a caregiver, maybe not necessarily me wanting to identify as a caregiver, because at the time you're still going through the notion that you're an active duty family, you're a proud military serving family. And sometimes that word can be a little bit scary because you don't know what that looks like then and how that can impact, a military family. But I will say, when I talk to active duty families, I try to ensure them, if something were to happen to you, God forbid, or, when you're looking at your paperwork and you're identifying an emergency point of contact, is that emergency point of contact somebody who could stay with you for life to help care for you if something were to happen? Is that somebody who you would want to be in the room with you for medical appointments or to help you at home with filling medications or prepping meals or helping around the house or outside in the yard? Think about it that way, is that emergency point of contact that you're identifying as a military member could potentially be a caregiver at one point in your life, and keeping that in mind that we all need somebody to help us. As far as our veterans, I think we've done a great job in really getting through the system and helping them understand it's okay to identify somebody. We need to identify somebody. And I think our Department of Veterans Affairs has done a great job of incorporating that caregiver component into the language and into the work that they do with those loved ones. caregivers really sustain the life of our veterans. And identifying as a caregiver is key because it gives you the tools and the sense of empowerment that I can be his wife when I need to be his wife, but I can also be his caregiver. I can get him up out of bed and say, no, you're not going to stay in bed today. I need you up. I need you to get your medication. You got to get a shower, and provide that tough love. So it's very important that we help our community from all areas, from the active duty side all the way through to veterans, in identifying somebody who they love to be by their side.
But I think the great thing too in having a lot of these local community advocates and fellows and groups out there is that so often caregivers express this feeling alone, and we know when I was talking to your colleague Marianne, we talked a little bit about I think the military does a much better job than the general public in just making people feel like they're part of a tribe. You're part of a community already being part of the military, but you can still have that sense of aloneness. And I know with a lot of the mental health issues now that we see with the PTSD and TBI, we're going to be talking to one of your fellows, Roxana. I think her husband had suffered from a TBI, traumatic brain injury. I think that need to be able to talk to other caregivers who have gone through those experiences is so vital. What do you see in terms of the interactions of almost like a mentorship for caregivers who have already been through it, who can help people who are just maybe coming into it?
Yeah, I think that sense of camaraderie runs deep in our military community. We rely on that. We rely on others who understand what we've gone through. It's a very unique family life that we live, being a military family, and the challenges that we face can be, difficult at times. They can be rewarding, but really knowing that another family who's gone through those same challenges, gone through those same ups and downs, can make all the difference in how you're feeling supported and loved. I think the Elizabeth Dole Foundation does a great job of providing those peer relationships, not only through our fellows program and knowing that we have fellows on the ground in your state who want to connect with caregivers, but we also have our Hidden Heroes Caregiver Community, which is our Facebook page for caregivers of all kinds to join and really talk to other caregivers, listen from other ones, get resources, hear from the foundation, learn about the events we're hosting, and come to those events. Again, that identification piece is huge in how we support this community and get them what they need.
Yeah, about, oh gosh, it was maybe now 12 years ago or so, I was involved in a project with the National Alliance for Caregiving, and I had gone out and interviewed caregivers of veterans. We were doing a research study. This is way before RAND started all of their wonderful studies that I know that they do in collaboration with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. And some of the stories were just heartbreaking. I mean, all stories of, loss of limb, suffering from any kind of injury or whatever. But there was one story in particular of a wife who had a husband with PTSD that was pretty severe. And it just really impacted me. The mental health side of this and what we put our war fighters through is just, it's so amazing. How are you kind of dealing with that? And do you see more of that? Because we do talk a little bit more now about mental health. We didn't talk about it when we had veterans from the Korean War, like my stepdad, or Vietnam War, but now I think we're more open to recognizing the mental health impact. And so what do you see in terms of your communities?
Well, I think mental health is always going to be a priority for us at the foundation, but then in general, just as a caregiver myself and understanding, I know they always say you've got to put your mask on before you put it on others. And that's sometimes really hard for us to do as caregivers. We give so much of ourselves that sometimes that saying can get a little bit hard for us to understand, but it really is key. And I think even the pandemic helped teach us the needs of getting, mental health or wellness, and really focusing on how we're doing individually. We work closely with partners like Cohen Veterans Network, Headstrong, who are providing those services. There's easier access to mental wellness that, it's almost, there's no reason to not get the care. There's virtual opportunities. There's all types of holistic care that we can do to better ourselves. I think the mental wellness, we look at the RAND report from 2014 and then you look at it from 2024, it's still one of the top priorities that caregivers are not putting first, and they need to be putting that first. We need to help change the stigma around what mental health and mental wellness looks like, and just really encourage others. I mean, my family, we've all seen mental health. It took us a while to get there, but I think, my kids have even shared today that they wouldn't be who they are today without that help and support.
Yeah. Well, and to your point too, it can be very devastating, but it can also give us a sense of resiliency if we have the tools, have the support to face some of those challenges, particularly when it comes to that mental health. I didn't talk to Marianne as much about the statistics, but correct me if I'm wrong. We know right now there's 53 million family caregivers across the U.S., and I would say, is it about 10%? Is it 5 million or 7 million veterans who are receiving care, or 7 million veterans who are caregivers of veterans? Give me a sense of the span if this, because it's not a small group.
Yeah, no, it's not. It actually has increased. So in 2014, when we first did the RAND report, and this goes back to your question about identification too, and looking at it, and I really wanted to share this point because I think it goes to show that we are doing a great job of getting caregivers to identify. In 2014, when we first launched the RAND survey, only 5.5 million caregivers identified. And that's both pre and post 9/11. I want to say it was 2.3 million, somewhere in there, that were post 9/11, and the rest were pre 9/11 who identified out of that 5.5 million. I'm sorry, let me correct that statement.
Sure.
Out of the 5.5 million, it was only 1.5 million that were post 9/11 identifying. The rest were pre 9/11. So it was great to see that we had some identification and people were, understanding what that meant. But at the same time, now we look 10 years later in 2024, and that number has increased. We're now at 14.3 billion caregivers now. And I think people get nervous with that number, they get scared about it, but at the same time, just because of the overwhelming needs for resources for them, but at the same time, that goes to show we're getting the word out that caregiving and identifying as a caregiver is key. It is essential, and they're going to get connected to resources. So I think we're really doing a great job of helping caregivers identify at, the earliest ages of 20-something years old when they're first married, all the way up to, the parents retiring in their 70s. And so, I think that the statistics strongly show the increase of caregiving numbers.
Yeah, and to your point, a lot of times we think about, well, it's because, we've got people are living longer, that we have more people that need care. But you're right, it's also the identification. Caregivers are now starting to say, oh yeah, that is something I do. Okay, yeah, you can check that box for me that I'm a caregiver. And I know a lot of the caregivers of veterans are military, active military, or veterans themselves, correct?
Yes, we have quite a few, I think, veterans who are identifying more so as caregiving to either a non-veteran or a veteran member.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing. One of the things that I thought was really amazing about some of the stuff that you're doing is all of the resources that have really been developed, I think, and rightly so, for our veterans community and our caregivers. What are kind of some of the trends or some of the milestones that you've seen since 2012 when Elizabeth Dole Foundation started? And let's highlight those, but then what is still needed? Where do you still see, like, here's a gap we wish we could fill, or that's our vision for the future?
Sure. So, I mean, again, I think I contribute a lot of our growth and awareness to our fellows and to the caregivers who've come to us and shared their stories, because without that, we would not know what's really needed. I think the resources that we've helped develop along the way have been focused through our programs. Our Hidden Helpers Coalition is a great example. We've got, I want to say, maybe now over 200 coalition members that are a part of that effort. And what they're doing is working together to build the resources and those supports in place in order to benefit our military and veteran caregiving youth. Taking a look at what that looks like. So with MSEC, a Military Child Education Coalition, with Camp Corral, with Wounded Warrior Project, and each one of those organizations is building upon programs within themselves to benefit our military families.
Okay. We were talking about all the different organizations that have really kind of started to focus on military families, military veterans, caregivers of veterans. And I think a lot of the stuff that's being developed is our best practices for the broader caregiving population that we have, to help guide and navigate through very fragmented healthcare system. I know the VA's been doing better job since the caregiver support programs were kind of instituted a few years ago, but it's still pretty fragmented. Lots of delays, lots of time having to be spent to kind of just navigate through that. But also, again, just the local support services that are out there now, and so many different, as you said, VSOs, veteran service organizations, are great.
Yeah, well, I'm proud to see that these organizations are developing more caregiver intake forms. They're looking beyond the veteran in need. They're looking to who else is in the home that might need help. And so a lot of organizations are developing those intake forms to then connect them to resources. I think they're also all trying to develop different tools to make it easier when you're searching online. I know we're working with National Resource Directory. Elizabeth Dole Foundation even has our own family resource hub, which I would love to highlight, because I think what's really great about it is not only is it connecting you to those resources, but it's also creating a dashboard for our families to be able to create your own path and save. What have I looked up? What can I recommend? I think the best support systems we do have to offer still is peer-to-peer. So a lot of military families trust other military families. And in developing my dashboard, I can share that with other military families and say, these were great resources for me. In expanding upon those testimonials to be able to encourage others to trust the system, and what we have to offer. But organizations are really developing and coming along well with expanding their efforts to the larger community of caregiving and family.
Yeah, and back to an earlier point you made about maybe the person receiving the care, the spouse or whomever, doesn't necessarily want to feel like I have a caregiver. And it makes it tough then for that caregiver to identify that way. But, letting people know, even if you just do it to the outside world so that you can access those resources, becomes, really critical. And, one of the things that I've seen that's started happening, particularly in the workplace where I do a lot of work with employers, is that caregiving is now talked about broadly. It can be everything from caregiving for a child all the way caring for a grandparent or an in-law or parent or whomever. And because it is a little bit broader definition, we know that um, caregivers and parents talk to each other, right? Share resources. Hey, this is the diaper that works best, or, this is the best kind of stroller, or whatever happens to be. And I think the more we can get the caregivers of people who have certain disabilities or chronic illness, or who are older and aging, you're going to find that richness of resources as well. So we just have to start those dialogues. And it seems like you guys are doing phenomenal work in that area.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're doing our best. We're doing what we can to expand it and expand the language. I think so much of our language really needs to change, and that's one area, is that holistic opportunity of military and veteran families, military connected youth, that, our military kids still so much identifies with military of active duty children, but military connected youth really brings together all the children who are impacted by military service or veteran type or wounded warrior type care. And so expanding that language, I still think we need to do a better job of educating society about these types of injuries, who's coming home with these, with TBI and PTS and what that looks like, and to not shy away from it. I think so many people don't know how to address it. And it really is just walking up to that military member or that family member and just letting them know, hey, I appreciate what you have done. I thank you for your service, and I thank your family for their service. And expanding that conversation again, that language of, I think your family, your loved one, or do you have a loved one who you're getting help with, and just continuing the conversation and outreach.
I really love that you said that, because that was going to be one of my questions, just for the civilian listeners out there. What should we say when we see a veteran or a veteran's family, or whomever? What are the words? And you just said it, just thanking them for the service that they've provided, and what they've done for us. as a society and overall. Yeah. So what, I know that there's obviously you've got a lot of goals for the future. What are, one of the top one or two goals that you're looking at trying to accomplish?
Well, I think coming out of our RAND research from last year in September, when we first launched this 2014 Emerging from the Shadows report, and you can learn more about it online on our hiddenheroes.org website and our elizabethdole.foundation.org website. But coming out of that, we've developed 4 different types of pillars. And those 4 pillars look at everything from the mental wellness to the children to the financial piece and the ecosystem. And we want to do a deep dive into, we did that report in 2014. We have this new information 10 years later. What can we do to continue the conversation? Where are we missing, key supports? And so we're looking forward to this year and really diving deep into those conversations and working with our MSOs, our VSOs, our Department of the VA, DOD, to just really bring togetherness and unity and understanding how we can support these families. So we are focused on those 4 pillars. I will say too, I think, in general, from my own personal aspect, I see a big need for DoD support, getting awareness into our families' hands. I was prepared for my husband to maybe not come home. You're prepared for life or death when you deal with deployments and military life, but you're not necessarily taught about the what if. What if he comes home with a TBI or a PTSD? How do we navigate that then? How do we learn from that as a family and understand what this new life is going to look like for us? So I think we have a lot of work to do with our DoD families and educating them and letting them know it's okay to get help and it's okay to identify as a caregiver.
Yeah, and that important piece, because in general caregiving, we talk about care transitions, and there's a lot of gaps. You're discharged from the hospital, you're either going maybe to a rehab facility or to home. There isn't as much of that hand holding. You're just kind of, good luck, here's some resources that you can call. And so I think you're right. I think the care transitions, having, the veterans come back, and what does that mean to the family, depending on what maybe they have suffered from, is so critical. Well, Liz, it has been fantastic talking to you. I could talk to you for a whole nother hour there, but thank you so much for sharing all of the great work that the Elizabeth Dole Foundation is doing. As I said, I've been a huge fan ever since you guys launched. What would it be now? 13 years ago, right? You're coming up on your 15th anniversary in a couple of years here. Tell us again where our listeners can learn more, whether they maybe are a caregiver of a military or active service person and want to apply for your fellows program, or just get involved to support military families.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sherry, and thank you so much for having me on and for highlighting the great work of Elizabeth Dole Foundation. I've been in this for 10 years myself, and I'm very passionate about what we do, and I love this mission, so thank you for highlighting it. For anybody interested in learning more about us, I highly recommend going to elizabethdole.foundation.org, and then you can take a look in there. You can also email us at info@elizabethdole.foundation.org. So I hope that, caregivers will reach out, ask questions, just general public. If you think you might be a caregiver and doing any one of those activities of supporting a loved one, please reach out to us, because if we don't have the resources, we'll at least put you in the hands of somebody who does.
Well, those are great. We'll make sure that we have both of those on our episode guide page so people can find it easily. And again, Liz, thank you so much. And thank you for your family service to providing the freedom and liberty that all of us, enjoy in this country. We just really appreciate you.
Great. Thank you, Sherry.
So I am really thrilled to have our guest on this episode because she is with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, which is a phenomenal group. She's going to tell us a lot more about that, but they are all about supporting the caregivers of veterans. And specifically, there is a core program called the Hidden Heroes program, which Marianne is very much involved in and oversees. So she'll tell us all of those details. So Marianne, welcome to Caregiving Club on Air.
Yes, thanks so much for having me, Sherry. It's an honor to be here.
Well, it's just so great to talk to you. As I mentioned, veterans are close to my heart. My stepdad was a Navy veteran, and everything that our veterans and military families do for us is just so critical, and something I think that, we sometimes tend to overlook. All of our freedoms and liberties are not free, and they can come at a cost. And a lot of the veterans and the families who are out there making those sacrifices, we just really, love them and support them. And I know that's the focus of what you guys do. Before we launch into the interview, we always ask our guests, where are we talking to you from today?
Absolutely. I am in San Diego, but our headquarters is located in Washington, D.C. I like to say I'm the Elizabeth Dole Foundation West Coast office, and that's because I'm also a caregiver to my Navy veteran mother. So, you sharing about the family aspect, your personal story, I share in much of it, and that journey started at a young age into adulthood now. And so it's really an honor again to work for a wonderful organization. So I'm excited to share about our mission today.
Well, and I know you're going to talk about the organization, but I'd love to hear your personal story as well. And by the way, it's great to have a fellow kind of Southern Californian. I'm actually up the coast from you a little bit, so it's great. We've got two West Coasters on the podcast today. And again, thank you for your family and your mom's service. So, one of the things that I thought we would just make sure our audience understood is, what is the Elizabeth Dole Foundation? What was the core mission when the organization was founded? And then specifically more about this core program called Hidden Heroes. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So the Elizabeth Dole Foundation was founded in 2012 by Senator Elizabeth Dole. She founded that mission when she was walking the hallways of Walter Reed Medical Center at the time when her husband, the late Senator Bob Dole, was confined there. And so she realized that family members were playing a huge part in their veterans' care, their service members' care. And so that's when she founded her mission to champion what is now over 14.3 million military and veteran caregivers through advocacy, legislation, research, and direct support. And so we've grown really over the years, and we've coined our military and veteran caregivers hidden heroes because of all the critical behind the scenes work they do in caring for their veteran. Not only are they driving their veteran to appointments, they're providing emotional care, they're helping with activities of daily living, bathing, feeding, you name it. And so we've known that they are really the forefront of our mission as the hidden hero. And we've also coined their children, those who are in the household caring for their wounded warrior parent, grandparent, sibling, as hidden helpers. And so we're really, blessed to have such an incredible mission that really brings military and veteran caregivers into the spotlight and give them more visibility. And so that really goes back to our Hidden Heroes campaign. And so I oversee our Hidden Heroes Communities program, which is our Hidden Heroes Caregiver Community and our Hidden Heroes Cities and Counties program. And really, it really brings awareness and it reaches caregivers both virtually, but also throughout the nation.
Well, and I think that's so important. One of the things that I think we can take out of the playbook, if you will, of military families is that they have always come together, and they are such a supportive unit, if you will, that family unit. And often we talk to family caregivers or talk about family caregivers feeling all alone, in their journey of caregiving, even though they may have siblings or spouses or partners or adult children or whatever, they feel alone. What do you tend to hear from your the hidden heroes? I like to call them also. I did some research many years ago on caregivers of veterans, and we call them heroes on the home front. Is how I like to think about it. For anyone who's deployed. But what are the stories, or what are the things you're hearing from the Hidden Heroes community in terms of how they're feeling about their caregiving journey with their veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, as a caregiver, it is as a caregiver, just an overall, it's a very unique experience. And then, as a military and veteran caregiver, you have that culture and lifestyle from the military, which makes it even more unique. And so, as a caregiver, it's important to have a community. And so, we've seen from research that social isolation is a prominent issue within caregiving. And so, caregivers, especially from the military and veteran background, the conditions are far more unique. So we're seeing traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, caring for a service member or veteran who is a paraplegic or quadrilegic. And so not everyone really can understand that caregiving experience unless you are within that community or you've been around it. And so that's something that caregivers, share all the time, that community is extremely important to them, to find that belongingness, to find some place that they can be with other caregivers and share, about insights on the VA. How do you best navigate, the behaviors that may come from PTSD? So it really is all around. In our Hidden Heroes caregiving online community, we have about over 3,000 caregivers from just all around the world, but all around the country, from rural communities to urban communities. And they come together to share those experiences, to exchange wisdom, but also they get to be a cheer squad for each other. So we have wellness challenges, and that challenge is from Valentine's Day, where they come together and celebrate their wins as caregivers on the journey, and as well as others, in terms of what advice would you be willing to give to other caregivers that may have similar experiences caring for these unique conditions. So overall, just to sum it up, community is extremely important for our caregivers, and that's the stories that we hear every day in our community.
And I think that's so important. We talk a lot about support groups, again, with other caregivers, whether it's Alzheimer's or cancer or, multiple sclerosis or whatever. And I think it's so important to just be able to tap into a group that really gets you and gets what your loved one's going through. And I think for the military and veteran caregivers, that lifestyle and even though let's say the injuries or something like TBI might be similar to somebody who's not in the military, but it's the lifestyle really that I think helps, because when you are in that group, you really get each other. You know what that life is about. You know what the risks were. You know what the issues might be now with your loved one who's maybe struggling with something like PTSD or whatever. I think those things are so critical. One of the things that we thought was really interesting is I hear that a lot of the younger military caregivers, so when they had a loved one who maybe was deployed in OEF, OIF in Afghanistan or wherever, they seem to obviously be coming together maybe a little bit more organically, whereas maybe some of the older veterans who were in, whether it was even the Korean War, which is what my stepdad was in, or Vietnam War, or, Desert Storm, aren't maybe as engaged. Can you talk to that a little bit, what the age groups are in the Hidden Heroes communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Hidden Heroes is open to all eras, both pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And we do see often more post 9/11 caregivers, or those from the Desert Storm, pre 9/11 era. And I really do think it's been the way that caregiving has been talked about throughout the years, more of the awareness and visibility around caregiving. And so I think that's why with post 9/11 caregivers, or pre 9/11 Desert Storm, there's been, more opportunities for peer supports or access to various programs, especially, within the VA. Previous to the Mission Act that was passed in 2020, the VA Caregiver Support Program, specifically the Program of Comprehensive Assistance for Family Caregivers, it's a stipend program for military and veteran caregivers, was predominantly for post 9/11 caregivers. And since then, it's really opened up, to all eras back to World War II. And so I think, there was just more visibility and awareness for post 9/11 caregivers versus our pre 9/11 caregivers. I also think, our pre 9/11 caregivers didn't realize they were caregiving until you tell them, and they've been doing it on their own without, resources. And so sometimes we do see those conversations between 9/11 and post 9/11 caregivers in our peer support programming. And so they'll exchange, different ways that they approach, PTSD, and it's uniquely different. And so that's why I think, we see, a greater we see post 9/11 caregivers identifying more than our pre 9/11. But, that's a challenge that we're working with, and, we're encouraging our pre 9/11 caregivers to identify more as caregivers and really honor them in the roles and the responsibilities that they've done, for the past few years.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're so right. I think there's so much more conversation now around caregiving. What is that? Am I one? Will I be one? All of those types of conversations that we're having. I think also too, and again, maybe this is just my personal experience with grandfather who was also in World War II. They just didn't talk about their service. They came home, they got back into life, and even though they may have been suffering in the shadows, they didn't talk about it, and therefore their spouse or partner or family didn't talk about it and didn't maybe, until we started asking questions, they weren't sharing,
Yeah.
with us, and certainly not sharing, I think, maybe more of the darker, like, negative side of some things that could happen. You mentioned helping the caregivers of veterans kind of navigate the VA, and the VA I know does a lot of really good things, but it's like everything else in healthcare, very fragmented, lots of little nuances. I always tell caregivers, particularly if it's maybe an adult son or daughter out there caring for a loved one who is a veteran, always look for what can the VA do for you? Because they often forget to tap into those possible benefits. Can you just kind of hit maybe some of the highlights? And one of the things I love, and you can tell me if it's still there as part of a benefit, is the respite hours that can be provided to the caregiver to get that break.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the VA has a variety of respite or home health care programs that one can tap into. I think with the program of comprehensive assistance for caregivers, that one's the stipend one and requires, greater eligibility of over 70% with veterans. For veterans with a disability, there's about 30 hours of respite that's allocated there. And then other programs such as Veterans Directed Care, you have Homemaker and Health Aid. Each are respite form programs, and so that would require again an application and a review. And then, of course, those hours would be specific towards the program based on the various assessments that they take place in the VA. So it is a little bit tricky, but those are resources that are available to our veteran caregivers.
One other question I just thought of is that, particularly again, maybe with some of the older vets and their family caregivers, even if your loved one develops cancer, and even if that cancer isn't necessarily tied to what we are now, we know about the burn pits, and, we know years ago from Vietnam, the Agent Orange, association of diseases and stuff. But let's just say it's cancer, you're not quite sure what the source was. Um, that still doesn't prohibit you from joining Hidden Heroes. And in other words, it doesn't have to be, war related, right? Or war fighter related for the caregivers to come together.
Absolutely, yes. So we see it all the time too, in terms of caregivers are caring for a veteran that was in a motorcycle accident. They have a traumatic brain injury, right? And as you mentioned, the VA, is an incredible resource, and that's where caregivers can really seek those resources out. And again, they're navigating the same system of what a veteran who has a traumatic brain injury from war, right? So in hindsight, we support, all caregivers that are caring for veterans with just any injury.
Yeah, and you've done some great work, Marianne. I know that you kind of oversee this whole Hidden Heroes program, and as you said, it's across the country, and you've got caregivers coming together online, in person. Tell us, maybe a little bit more about how much it's grown, the communities, and what they do to kind of support each other, both maybe virtually or digitally, as well as in real life and in person.
Yeah, absolutely. So, our Hidden Heroes caregiver online community, that's our virtual peer support program. And so, again, we have over 3,000 caregivers that really come together and they exchange that support, wisdom, and encouragement every day. And it's a vetted community. So, we make sure the caregiver comes from a military and veteran background through verification documents because we want to ensure the privacy and security of our caregiver community. And so there's that virtual component of interacting with other caregivers across the country or even across the world. And then we also have our Hidden Hero Cities and Counties program, which has over 280 communities that have pledged their support to military and veteran caregivers. And that also includes 12 states like Maryland, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, who've recently joined. And what that really looks like is our cities, counties, and state leadership will pass a proclamation that raises awareness for military and veteran caregivers. And then they work with our state Dole Caregiver Fellows on creating a specific initiative that is relevant to their caregiver community. So in Alaska, we've seen, peer support coffee meetups because we know that seasonal affective disorder is very real. And then we've seen in El Paso with them creating just big resource summits that really delve into end of life planning to even thinking about transition for caregivers and really what to expect on the caregiving journey at all stages. And then we've even been very creative with different groups. So, for example, the Daughters of American Revolution in Idaho decided to take up the Hidden Heroes campaign as a 2-year initiative, and they've passed, proclamations in all 44 counties to raise awareness for military and veteran caregivers. So those are just some of the unique, opportunities that communities have really delved into supporting military and veteran caregivers, creating really inclusive, spaces, helping them, self-identify because caregivers, I think the biggest barrier for caregivers is identifying as a caregiver, right? I think, there's a lot of
Mhm.
stigma. We kind of discussed the mental health aspect. You said something about pre 9/11 caregivers where, they weren't talking about it as much. And I think part of it is the mental health component, right? We didn't start talking about mental health until the 2000s, really. And so things like that, right? Helping caregivers identify has been a huge part in our communities, but also making sure that the resources are inclusive for them as well. Also, making sure that their neighbors are educated and that they can lend a helping hand when their, veterans are going through, various episodes or just going through their illnesses and conditions. So we've just seen, tight community support all around.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that that recognition is starting to hopefully get more of a spotlight. Obviously, the great work that you guys are doing. I love the fact too that so often, and we hear this again across the spectrum of caregiving, the focus is on the person with the disease or the disability. Everybody always asks, "How's so and so doing?" or whatever. Very few people ask how you're doing as the caregiver. And so really putting the focus on that caregiver as an essential person in this whole, care equation and the life and quality of life of a loved one is just so important and gives recognition to, again, the sacrifice and the journey that those military caregivers are making. We talked before we came on live here a little bit about there was recent legislation that I think was recently signed by the President Biden, actually at the beginning of the year, and to look to again continue to provide those benefits and things. What are some of the things that you feel have definitely improved over the 13 years, I think it is, you said now that Elizabeth Dole Foundation has been in existence. And what are some of the things that you're still working on that you wish, okay, we wish we could do this or we're really working towards this?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we were talking about the Senator Elizabeth Dole 21st Century Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act. That's a mouthful, I know. So we just call it the Elizabeth Dole Act, so EDA here at the Dole Foundation. But we really have delved into more legislation. So, as mentioned about the Mission Act, we really supported just the expansion of the program of comprehensive assistance at at the VA. So that really, expanded eligibility for caregivers from all eras to receive a caregiver stipend. And then with this new EDA Act, we are expanding, home-based care and community care to our veterans and caregivers. So when we do think about, our rural caregivers that need greater resources, especially for mental health, we're thinking about those grants that are within the legislation and just other components that allow veterans and caregivers to age independently at home and have that care. Because we know that we've seen from our research actually that veterans and caregivers who get to age at home have healthier and more positive health outcomes overall. So we've seen that really grown, as well as our RAND study findings. So we really initially kicked off our RAND study back in 2014, and really it's the first groundbreaking piece of research that covered military and veteran caregivers. And then 10 years later, in 2024, we released the second one last year. We saw a huge jump of caregivers from 5.5 million military and veteran caregivers to 14.3 million. And so that says, either caregivers are identifying as caregivers by realizing they are caring for a veteran through activities of daily living or just providing that emotional support. And so we really are doing more work to, spread more awareness and really reach those new caregivers that are, stepping into that role. We also have identified 2.3 million youth in military and veteran caregiving households. And so we've created a Hidden Helpers Coalition to support them with over 100 organizations. And so we're really looking at better youth support. How can we raise awareness in our schools, in our communities for hidden helpers? How can we, make sure that they're also growing up to have, a childhood beyond caregiving, right? Making sure that they get to live out that kid identity that they deserve to also pursue. And so we're looking at, youth support, financial wellness initiatives, mental health, and an in-home care ecosystem overall as the next steps for the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. And we're really excited. And again, data really helps us inform our evidence-based approaches towards programming, but we also can't do it without our caregivers, our caregiver communities. And so that's what makes Hidden Heroes just particularly so important for us to make sure that we're on the community's heartbeat and really understanding the issues that are important to them.
Wow, so much great stuff. And I'm so glad that you brought up the youth caregivers. I know that the stat, I think, from the American Association of Caregiving Youth says that there's between 2 and 3 million children under 18 who are actually primary caregivers of a loved one. We interviewed very early when I first started the podcast, Richard Louie, who did that documentary on military caregivers who were young. They were in their teens or early 20s, called Sky Blossom, and it was fascinating. The documentary is wonderfully done. But I think it shows, again, the impact, right, of caregiving and how there are sometimes a primary caregiver, but there can also be the backup caregivers and how it impacts family and all that is so important. And wow, you really also, those numbers are almost staggering when I hear them from the RAND study going up. But I think you're right. I think we're willing now to talk more about things like mental health issues, whether it's PTSD, or anxiety disorders and other things that we know can affect our warfighters, and certainly affect their family caregivers. So all this work is so absolutely fantastic. I didn't know if you wanted to share more of your story with your mom, and give us a little bit of insight. But it sounds like obviously you've been a wonderful caregiver for her. So if there's anything you want to share with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thank you for that, Sherry. So, I became a caregiver at age 11 for my mom, who's a Navy veteran now, and so it's been a unique, experience having to really continue that into adulthood as she ages. And both my parents really, because my father is also up there in age. I'm their only child. And so really, the story started with PTSD. My mom was an X-ray tech, and she went to Iraq, and she came back with PTSD. And we, as a family, didn't know that these were the symptoms, right? We were barely just talking about mental health, and so I would see her go through nightmares, just episodes of depression. And so it took a lot of pamphlets at doctor's appointments to really learn what PTSD was. And then eventually, physical injuries kicked in. And so, caregiving has been a life, but also it's been an honorable role to be with my mom, to learn, about her and just be with her, in this time. So our relationship is very strong as a result. Do we have, sometimes we don't have the best days, which is very real in caregiving. But at the end of the day, you take those moments to yourself where self-care is extremely important, right? And that's something that we often promote in our Hidden Heroes community all over. It's always mental wellness and thinking about self-care. But once you get those moments to yourself, you can handle the caregiving journey. And again, it's an honor to care for someone just as great as her. And I'm
Well,
sure
it's oh,
others.
go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I
No,
was going to
you're
say
good.
your expression. I mean, that's so beautiful, and I think again, many caregivers say, yeah, it can be stressful, frustrating, depressing. There's all the negative words, but on the other hand, there are a lot of silver linings. I know I found silver linings when I was caregiving for both my dad and my stepdad. You're a sky blossom then, because you were a young youth caregiver for your mom. Um, and I'm so glad there's communities like Hidden Heroes and the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, so that again we don't have to feel alone. We can find those networks and those support communities that help us so much. And your story is really beautiful, caring for both of your parents. I know it's hard to be an only child because there isn't that sibling, that you might be able to lean on or whomever, but hopefully you've got a good support network. One of the things because I've been in the caregiving space now for over, I think it's 20 years. But I've always focused on the self-care piece. I think that's so important. So, I often talk about, even if it's just, I call it the 7-minute increments. If you can just find the 7 minutes, to do something for yourself here or there, just kind of gives you a little bit of that strength back. But so, Marianne, I know you were checking your notes, and as we've been talking, you've been telling us so many great benefits.
Okay, so just going back to the program of comprehensive assistance for family caregivers, which is that VA caregiver stipend program, instead of it being 30 hours of respite, caregivers are able to receive 30 days of respite care, which means just more, short-term respite for them in order to take some time off for caregiving and doing activities that they need to do for themselves, whether that's appointments, to even self-care.
Oh, I'm so glad that you corrected that, because I think I may have made that mistake myself too, calling it 30 hours. But you're saying it's 30 days, so it could be multiple hours in those 30 days. It could actually be beyond the 30 hours, right?
Absolutely. It's in within a year range. So as long as you get those 30 hours in a year, you should be good to go.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for kind of enlightening us on all of these great benefits that we have for our caregivers. We just really appreciate it. Marianne, it's just been so great talking to you. Is there anything else we didn't cover that you feel is important for our audience to know?
I don't think so, Sherry. I think, that I've said a lot. But all the while I just want folks to know, they're not alone on the caregiving journey. There are communities and folks for them as resources. And so I hope that the Elizabeth Dole Foundation can be that organization for them, and they can learn more at elizabethdolefoundation.org/hiddenheroes.org if they'd like to sign up for our online community, which is the Hidden Heroes Caregiving Community.
Great. I was so glad you brought that up. And we're going to have that also listed on our episode guide page. And I'm going to be talking to one of your colleagues about some of the other caregiver programs and policy and things that you're doing, and also one of your caregiver fellows. So I'm thrilled to have like the Elizabeth Dole Foundation themed podcast for this episode. So, Marianne, thank you so much for making time. And it's just been wonderful talking to you. And again, thank you for everything you're doing to support our caregivers of military veterans.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Sherry. And thank you so much for all you've done as a caregiver and just sharing this platform with other folks who really, are on the caregiving journey themselves.
So wasn't that a wonderful trio of interviews with the ladies from the Elizabeth Dole Foundation? I just want to do a shout out to Liz and Marianne and Roxana for taking the time to talk to me and give me so many, such great insights as to what the organization is doing and how it supports, caregivers, particularly caregivers of our veterans. So you can learn more. We're going to have links and everything on our episode guide page. Now we want to turn to National Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month, as I mentioned, in March. And, we talked with Roxana about what her husband Victor went through. And we have Dr. Gail Anderson, who is with the Brooks Rehabilitation Hospital in Florida. And she's here to really help us understand more, the kind of the TBIs that can happen to any of us. We have 1.5 million people who suffer from TBIs every year. And she's going to tell us, it could simply be from falling at home and, other things. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. But more importantly, she's going to share with us some resources and some insights on how do we communicate best with our loved ones who have a TBI. What can we do as family caregivers to support them? Which I think is just, really great information. And I think you'll find this interview really insightful and helpful if you have a loved one or if you know of, friends or whomever who have loved ones who have TBIs. You can share this with them because it's really, really, really good information from Dr. Anderson. So with that, here is my interview with Dr. Gail Anderson. Well, I am really thrilled to have our next guest for this episode, who is Dr. Gail Anderson, who is a board-certified clinical psychologist with Brooks Rehabilitation and an expert in this area of traumatic brain injury, TBI, that we've been talking about. So, Dr. Anderson, welcome to Caregiving Club on Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And, as I mentioned to you earlier, one of the questions we always ask, or the first question we always ask our interviewees and our experts on this podcast is, where are we talking to you from today?
Now at Brooks Rehabilitation Behavioral Medicine Department. So I work with patients and families in our outpatient rehabilitation psychology service area, as well as our brain injury and spinal cord injury day treatment programs.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And, on this episode, we are celebrating March as Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month. And I wanted to have you on because I think that a lot of people are familiar with this, this reference to TBI when it comes to our veterans and our war fighters, or maybe professional, athletes, football players, hockey players, people who might get concussions and things like that. But really, TBI can really affect any of us. So give us a sense of how many people actually are affected by TBI and what are some of the different ways that you're seeing traumatic brain injury come into, your clinic.
Absolutely, yeah. So the statistics vary a little bit, but approximately 1.5 million people, so 1.5 million people in the United States every year experience some form of traumatic brain injury. Additionally, there are over 5 million people living in the United States right now with disability from TBI.
Wow, which is a staggering number. I don't think that, I even thought that it would be that high. And, as I mentioned, we kind of typically default to people who are in, maybe careers or professions or positions where there might be a little bit more combat or, connection. But you can fall, like you can be older at home and fall and get a TBI, or you can be younger and, and all these other things that we've seen. So what are kind of the symptoms or the red flag warnings that people should be aware of? Because sometimes it's not always so dramatic that what's going on. So what are some of those subtle signs of TBI?
Absolutely. So if you're having changes in your cognitive abilities, right, it's always a good idea to talk with your physician. Now, of course, if you sustain a head trauma, right, that would be a time to get checked out, maybe emergently, right? Looking at different kinds of speech changes, rapid emotional changes, right? There can be a lot of things that cause symptoms, and I always want to say, like, hey, it's probably a good idea to be sure, right?
Yeah, better safe than sorry, right? I mean, we hear years ago the actress, I can't remember her last name now. She's married to Liam Neeson, but Natasha something. But they'd been out skiing, and she kind of had tripped and fallen, and didn't think much about it, and unfortunately, had a really bad headache, didn't go and get it checked out, and was found dead the next morning. So you want to really, I think, yeah, definitely pay attention. And whenever it comes, I've always been told, whenever it comes to the head and the brain, don't delay. What are your thoughts on that?
Time is of the essence. A lot of the interventions that are provided in emergent settings do very much depend on the time. So this is probably a good moment to, make a distinction between traumatic brain injury and acquired brain injury, right? So traumatic injury being some kind of impact to the head, and then the acquired brain injury are things like strokes or aneurysms, right? That can kind of develop over time with no injury. And so this is just really something to, be mindful of, that for both of those categories, we would want to get evaluation as soon as possible. Now, it's also possible that you experience some symptoms, right? You go in and get checked out, and you have a concussion, and it's going to be all right. And, you really just need to be mindful of yourself and take some time. But this is really something that you would want a physician to determine.
Absolutely. And you mentioned things like a stroke or an aneurysm, and sometimes, particularly I think with stroke, we think of that affecting mostly, a much older population. But then I think about, Senator John Fetterman, who was, a fairly youngish man in his, I think, early 50s when he had his stroke. And gratefully, he's been able to really rehabilitate. But, it could be really anybody of any age that we're living with or caring for.
Yeah, and I do think that there are trends, right? There are trends in the statistics. So of course, as you get older, right, it's something you might hear about more commonly. But really, those rapid changes in functioning, right? If you're suddenly unable to balance, or you're having trouble walking, you have issues. You can't remember what you said a moment ago, right? And this is more than a transient concern or like a short term thing. Like you're like, wow, this is really happening. It's just a good idea to get it checked out. They do have, the equipment and the ability to determine what happens next, if anything, right, at an emergency room setting.
Right. So, as we mentioned, we're talking to you in March, and that is our month that we dedicate to making more awareness around traumatic brain injury. And I was really interested because you had sent me some strategies for family caregivers that are really great in communicating with a loved one who may have TBI, but also just being able to support them in the right way. So, can you kind of take us through that list?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you are in the position of caring for someone who has experienced a TBI, there are a lot of things to be mindful of, right? As a person without an injury, right? You're helping an
Right.
adult do things that they would have done themselves in the past. Okay.
Right.
So, first of all, I want to encourage everyone to talk to them in your regular voice. Okay. Sometimes when people need help with activities of daily living, so like dressing, feeding, bathing, a lot of us don't really have another kind of template in our head for that besides childcare. So
Right.
we may find ourselves kind of naturally changing our voice a little bit, but it's important to remember that this person is still the person, right, that they were before the injury. And so,
Right.
although you might have to repeat yourself more or use some more strategies to help them remember things, shorten up your phrases, right, make them a little more simple, that doesn't mean that we want to use baby talk. So
Yeah.
that would be something right off the bat, I would say.
And I'm just gonna my grandmother had a stroke. I was in high school when it happened, and I think that's so important because obviously with the stroke, and at that time, it was a long time ago, we didn't know as much about rehabilitation and speech therapy, but she had a lot of difficulty kind of, engaging in communication, but her brain was still working very, very well. And you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. I think there's the dignity part of an older
Yes.
adult that you want to pay attention to. So thank you for bringing that up. So important. So I didn't mean to interrupt your list, but I just want to make a comment on that one. So go ahead. What's our next item?
Of course. It is so important. Okay. So they might not be able to make decisions on their own right now. Okay. And I'm not talking about a legal distinction, right? We're just talking about like, hey, there's some really important care decisions that need to be made. Sometimes there are concerns about like, do I need to take, short-term disability? Is there kind of this financial management piece? And so you probably would be in a position to support them very significantly throughout that process. So just making sure that you're talking to them, that you're keeping them involved in the process, even if they're not really, understanding necessarily or able to articulate that they understand. It's at least, respectful, right? Honor their presence in that process. It's also important for you to, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just a quick question on that one. So that you're not talking about necessarily stepping in as their guardian or custodian and making decisions for them. You're just talking about keeping them in the loop, making sure that they, try to understand some of the things that are going on, correct?
Yeah, because if you think about it, right, like let's say, I fall and I hit my head and I go to the emergency room and I do have a significant thing going on and so I need to stay in the hospital now. Well, let's say that I haven't retired yet. Right. There are all sorts of things that need to happen at that moment, right? I need to communicate with my job. If I'm not able to do that, then, my partner or my child or whoever who is helping me through that process kind of starts to step into my roles almost automatically.
Gotcha.
And so even if I'm not necessarily seeming present in that moment, it's, I still want to know what's going on.
Sure.
And so that's one way to kind of keep people in that kind of respectful, autonomous position. It's also important for you to remember as caregivers that you have medical and emotional needs as well.
I think that's the one that I've focused on for the many, many years now that I've been in family caregiving is that, often it is a tragedy, crisis, event, whatever you want to call it. We swoop in, we're superheroes. We swoop in, we kind of help save the day, but then we start to, it's not over in 5 minutes, right? There's kind of this ongoing process and we start to lose our own selves during that process. What are some of the things that you talk about with family members in how do you maintain that balance in your responsibilities as a caregiver and your responsibilities to your own self-care?
Yeah, so I think your expectations for yourself are important in this moment, right? You are stepping into the role of not just being your own adult self, right? But functioning in many of the external areas for now 2 adults, right? If not a whole family, depending on your family system, right?
Right.
And that's really, really hard. And so you need to take breaks, you need to schedule things, right? Sometimes there's so much to do, it can feel like an endless list, but there are only so many hours in a day, right? So like think how much time you would spend just like at a full-time job, right? 8, 9, 10 hours at most. I hope not, but yeah.
Right.
How much time are you spending every day, right? Are you taking that moment? Are you giving yourself a lunch break, right? Are you having that second to call your friend and go, wow, this is hard and I'm really upset?
Right.
You need to access that kinds of social support and really try your best to involve your community support system, right? So I talk with a lot of families who, whether it's their immediate or extended family or like church or community groups that they're a part of, like people often can help. And sometimes even people struggle with accepting that help, right? So I want to remind you, it does take a village. And so if you have those support systems to really try and involve them, because it's a big task. And like you said, it's not going to be done in 5 minutes. This is a long-term process.
Exactly. And I think that's the tough thing. I think, again, we give ourselves the ability, like I said, in the immediacy of a situation, we know we're probably going to drop a lot of things and not maybe focus as much on ourselves, but we have to kind of quickly get back to that balance of, okay, I still have needs. I need, like you said, I need a break. Or, I need to talk to someone because I'm frustrated, but I don't want to say that to my loved one, so I need to talk to somebody else. I need to have a good friend I can have a cup of coffee with and express those things, even though obviously you still love your loved one and you want to be there for them, but it can get really overwhelming. So I think you're absolutely right. I always like to say part of my things that I do in workshops with family caregivers and in education is that's why I like kind of this Monday reset point, because at least once a week, think about yourself. Think about how are you going to get a little me time this week, because sometimes we do have to try to plan it at a time, get that extra help that we need and everything.
Much so. And it's just really difficult, like for any adult to lose their independence, even if it's only for a period of time, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you can remember functioning at a higher level, right, of independence, it can feel like a significant loss and grief process. And so, yeah, just try to remember if you're frustrated or sad or having a hard time, like it's possible they are as well. And so you might be able to connect on that too.
Yeah, that's a good point too. You're right, not to forget what your loved one is going through. And I'm sure, depending on what the situation is, I know a lot of parents, older parents, don't want to be a burden to their adult children, so they've got that concern. If it's a spouse, it's like, well, we can't do all the things we used to do together, and I feel socially I'm taking away from things. So they're going through that old range of emotions as well. Are there any other critical insights, things we should know about, traumatic brain injury? I mean, you brought up so many great things about being a family member to support your loved one. Anything else that we should share with the audience?
Yeah, I just want to talk for a second about the environment. So, both the physical environment and the online environment. So physically, right, please be mindful of how chaotic or noisy or just loud that the environment can get. People with traumatic brain injuries often struggle with overstimulation, right? So this is a common feature in many different medical presentations for brain injury. So that being said, right, that would be like just a lot of things going on, right? Think like like a crowded concert, right? There's so much lights and noise and people and stuff going on. That would typically be very overstimulating.
Okay.
And so the more that you can do, especially in the beginning, to like keep things like fairly calm and consistent, right? That gives your loved one the space to really kind of focus that energy on themselves. Additionally, the online environment, right? So we have the internet at our fingertips. Most of us do. It's right in our pocket now, which means we can look up anything and everything.
Right.
It can be very complicated, right, to sit through these doctor's appointments and, medical teams, rehabilitation teams in the hospital, and they might be talking about things that you've never heard of. And you're like, oh my gosh, like I need to like educate myself. And I'm saying, yes, please do that to a degree. Okay, it's very easy to get kind of sucked into like these internet articles or searches or these symptoms mean this, right? And so if you find yourself getting overwhelmed repeatedly after you're looking things up, please talk with your medical team about the stuff that you need to understand, because we really do have endless access in that way to information, and it can be hard to digest and sift through it, especially if it's brand new.
Yeah.
On the positive side of things, oftentimes there are online networks that you can get connected with that can be a benefit to you and your family. So, keeping people updated, like there's different like profiles and stuff that you can communicate progress through rehabilitation. Sometimes there are like fundraising efforts online. So it's not all bad, right? Just be mindful of how you're using it. Like, is this adding energy, right? Or helping you in some way?
Yeah. It's such a great point. And I love that you brought up, we're much more educated health consumers.
Mhm.
But we do have to remember we all haven't gone to medical school or been trained, and so we can self-diagnose and it can be really dangerous. Or you can read something about a certain symptom. I know I've done this myself, and then you immediately go to the bad area, oh my gosh, it's cancer, right?
I have a pain in my finger and it's very dry. You know what I mean? Like it can be, it's good that we have this information. I still am overall on the side that it's very good that we have this access. But yeah, I just know that I've talked with a lot of family members about that who are like, gosh, I spent like 2 or 3 hours into this process and I'm still online, like looking through these articles and I don't know what they mean. And I'm like, hey, okay, let's take a deep breath here, right? And try and really evaluate
Right.
like, what are you concerned about, right? Is there a way to kind of condense those things, or is there a conversation you really need to have with a physician, right? Or
Yeah.
behaviorally, emotionally, someone like myself, right? Like, is this something we need to help kind of structure forward? Because that's our job, right? Is to help you through it.
Yeah, and also to relieve that anxiety, because it's the fear of the unknown, I think, that makes us so anxious. So if you can get help from an expert like you who can kind of bring that anxiety level down a bit and say, it's going to be okay. We're going to work through this. I also love your comment about social media because I do a lot of writing about that too. And I think very often when our lives have been disrupted by caregiving and maybe we go on our social media accounts, we see people taking fabulous vacations or, doing fun things that we've had to maybe miss out on. I think that you do have a little bit of that FOMO, right? That fear of missing out, and it starts to kind of, work against you. So I think, yeah, you're right. Be a little bit careful with social media in terms of trying to compare your life to others, but use it to connect with a circle of care and get the support that you need.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot of different networks that can be beneficial, different groups on online platforms that can help with resource provision and things like that. But yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. So just be very mindful of it because I mean, even comparisons to other brain injury survivors, right? I mean, the thing
Right.
about brain injury is it's so different. I mean, every presentation is so different, right? And we can see trends and we can tell you kind of what to expect, but just like you said, that grappling with the unknown is a big piece of it because every brain is different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So tell us before we let you go, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your insights. Tell us just a little bit more about what Brooks Rehabilitation Services, what you offer, where you're available, and what our listeners should know.
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of primary office here in Northeast Florida, if you're in Central or Northeast Florida or Southeast Georgia in particular, your physicians or your medical team might know about us. We offer a spectrum of care for patients requiring all different kinds of rehabilitation. So brain injury, spinal cord injury, multiple traumas, right? Things that often injuries or accidents, but pre-existing medical conditions can necessitate some of this as well, right? So think like MS or something like that. Our spectrum ranges from inpatient rehabilitation hospitals to, outpatient services. We have the day programs, like I told you about with the brain injury and spinal cord injury day programs. Our outpatient clinics offer occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech cog therapy. We have visual therapy through the Brooks Medical Group as well, and our physicians who practice in that hospital often maintain outpatient caseloads. There are also different kinds of facilities, like depending on where you're at in the caregiving process. So we also have like skilled nursing, respite care as well, and then like post-rehabilitation services. So just for example, our school reentry program, right? So if you think about
Right.
people who are trying to go back to high school or college, right? They can kind of help them get back on track to go through that process, and then home health services as well.
That's so wonderful, and I love that you mentioned respite because that's a big one I think a lot of caregivers aren't familiar with, and that's so
Mhm.
that you can get somebody to watch your loved one, make sure they're safe, but you can get that break, which is so great. One quick question, because I'm just curious about this. Do you find that a lot of the rehabilitation, is that where you need to bring your loved one to a facility and a, an OT or a PT expert, or are some of those being delivered in the home environment?
Yeah, so there are home health services, right? So Brooks offers home health services, and there are home health services I know through other organizations. So you can receive therapy in the home environment. I know that the bringing your loved one in, transportation can be difficult sometimes. I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting at there, but it can
Sure.
be challenging, especially if your patients or if your family members, right, our patients have devices that like may not fit in the car so easily or something like that. But typically, there are community programs that you can kind of get in touch with. And yeah, there are some services that aren't necessarily available in the home. Like, for example, I don't do home health care, right? I'm in psychotherapy services and behavioral medicine. And
Okay.
I don't believe the neuropsychological evaluations that we offer here either are available in home. None of our neuropsychologists can go to your home. So
Right.
I know that physical therapy, occupational therapy, right? There are some therapies that we very commonly offer in home.
Great. Well, that's helpful, I think, to our audience just to kind of know. But you're right. A lot of it, you have to go and see the experts so that they can test everything out. Well, Dr. Anderson, this has just been wonderful. And again, I thank you for your time to share with us all this great insight about traumatic brain injury, so that we can just be more aware and educated about it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode. A reminder, you can find more information in my book, Me Time Monday, The Weekly Wellness Plan to Find Balance and Joy for a Busy Life, or visit MeTimeMonday.com or CaregivingClub.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Caregiving Club on Air. Please hit the subscribe button to listen to us on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, SiriusXM, iHeartRadio, Pandora, as well as other listening channels. Check out all the resources and article links on our episode guide page at caregivingclub.com. Just hit the podcast tab at the top and email us with comments and questions at podcast@caregivingclub.com. Thank you again for listening, and take care and stay well.